My name's Beth Keene, and I'm the CEO of Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you so much for being here tonight for our program about banned books. I know this has been a difficult last 2 weeks for all of us. We've all been devastated by the atrocities committed by Hamas and the surge in anti-Semitism around the globe, and we're seeing on college campuses. And we're saddened by all of the innocent lives lost, and I know our hearts go out to all of the victims' families and all the people who are suffering. But sadly, never again is now. And Holocaust Museum LA's mission has become more critical and more relevant than ever. I'm heartened by seeing all of you here tonight. I mean, that's like the one bright spot in all of this, is that our community has been coming together to stand up against hate, and that's really important. And also we have wonderful elected leaders, which is really important. But Holocaust Museum LA's mission is to inspire humanity through truth and education. And for those of you who are new to our museum, we're actually the oldest Holocaust museum in the United States. We were founded by survivors who met at Hollywood High School in 1961, and they were true pioneers for Holocaust education, because it was really important for them at the time when everyone told them, "You're in America now, put this behind you." They said, we need to create a safe space where we can remember family members who perished, but also to start pooling their precious objects like letters, photographs, any kind of precious object they had from before, during, or after the war, and to start educating young people about what they had personally endured and about the Holocaust. And so we continue to honor their wishes, and we teach this history through these objects that tell personal stories. It's really important to preserve memory, to honor memory. And we have student tours every day of the week. Our student tours are free. We even provide grants for the bus transportation. Most of our students come from low-income school districts. So it gives me hope, because we know that we are changing student behaviors. If students walk in our museum doors as bystanders, they leave as upstanders. So with everything, the rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing, that is something that at least we know education is the greatest catalyst for change. I wanted to thank PEN America for partnering with us on this amazing program on book banning. It's kind of scary, this growing movement to silence voices and histories. And so I think this is going to be a really powerful conversation tonight. We have an amazing group of panelists. Our moderator this evening is Allison Lee. Allison is Los Angeles' managing director of PEN America, which was founded 101 years ago to raise awareness for the protection of free expression through the advancement of literature and human rights. She will be joined in conversation with critically acclaimed and award-winning author Alana K. Arnold, who has at least 16 young adult and middle grade books and have been banned or challenged, including What Girls Are Made Of. Her newest book, released just last week, is The Blood Years, a fictionalized version of her grandmother's teenage years growing up in Romania during the Holocaust. Dr. Eric Cervini, an award-winning author, producer, and historian of LGBTQ plus politics, whose first book, The Deviants' War, The Homosexual versus the United States of America, was a New York Times bestseller and finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He launched shopqueer.com. Is that a typo? That must be a typo. Oh, it's .co. Okay, just want to make sure I was saying it right. Okay. All right, I'm glad that's a good reason for it. Shopqueer.co, an independent queer bookshop, and the Rainbow Book Bus. And award-winning expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion within higher education, Tahifa Alexander, who serves as the CRT Forward Project Director at UCLA School of Law Critical Race Studies program. I also wanted to thank Flint Ridge Books for bringing a curated selection of banned books, including those by Alana and Eric, that are available for purchase. I don't know if you guys saw the table when you first walked in, which it's pretty shocking to see those books. Well, I'd like to hand it over to Allison now.
It's both not good to be here and very good to be here. I think this is such a fitting home for us to have this conversation because, you know, the issues of book banning and educational censorship is not just a fight for free expression, it's a fight for telling stories, stories that allow us to connect across divides and to connect across difference. And if ever there was a time for us to come together to fight for that, I think this is the time. You know, before we begin, I also just want to note that, you know, the story of the Holocaust didn't begin with the concentration camps or the death camps. It began by the systematic targeting of individuals with different identities. And it began with the removal of art and the restriction of books. You know, Heinrich Heine's famous words were, "When one burns books, they will soon burn people." And we're here this afternoon, this evening, to have this conversation because we are at a critical moment in this fight. It is a national fight, it is a organized fight, and I'm so grateful to be in conversation with each of you. Taifa, I'm wondering if you could start us off and give us a little bit of a historical context, because this also didn't just start. There's always been book banning, books that have been challenged, but this real organized effort, you know, really does have a starting point in this recent history. Can you give us a little bit of an education, of a background of where this all began?
Sure, absolutely. And I think a good place to start is the summer of 2020, really quickly, because that was when we were at a moment in time as a country where we could have lived up to our full potential as a truly multiracial democracy, right? There were schools and business people and government agencies that were committed to justice and committed to ensuring that the atrocities that occurred and took George Floyd's life in the summer of 2020 wouldn't happen. And that was met with immediate backlash. And so in the September of 2020, the Trump administration issued Executive Order 13950. And what that did was it banned certain types of trainings, and it also banned contractors from teaching certain topics. And then there was an accompanying Office of Budget Management memo that expressly prohibited critical race theory. And so I know we're going to talk about critical race theory in a second, so I won't go too far into that. But this executive order in September of 2020 really was the catalyst or the foundation for a lot of the legislation, the school board resolutions, the local policies aiming to restrict access to truthful information about race and systemic racism through a campaign to reject critical race theory. So to put it into context, during September of 2020, there were only 3 legislative efforts or legal efforts to restrict any sort of truth in education. Only 3 in September of 2020. Then we get to 2021, and there are 111. And then we get to 2022, and there are 550. And now, in October 2023, there are 750 different anti-CRT measures across the country between Alaska and New Hampshire and nearly everywhere in between. So the only state where we haven't found any anti-CRT activity is Delaware, which is very interesting. I don't know if you all have been to Delaware. I've been there a few times. But And we can talk about why Delaware might be an outlier, but that's just some context. And to also bring this into book banning, that same trajectory of this exponential increase is the same sort of exponential increase we see with book bans starting from 2020 up until today.
Thanks. So I want us to take the lens out, but before we take the lens out and look at this contextually within the national landscape, between the larger ed scare that we're seeing across the country and that sort of legislation, I want to draw the lens very close. So Alana, if I could start with you, I mean, you're a writer. You didn't get into writing so that your books could be banned. And, you know, just for those who don't know you, can you just talk a little bit about your work across the spectrum of children's literature? I want the audience to get a sense of what it is like to be a writer in this moment.
Yeah, so one thing I hear is, oh, your book got banned. Congratulations, that must be great for sales, which, you know, isn't true. But so I am a writer of books for and about children and teens. I have everything from picture books. I have a charming, sweet picture book called What Riley Wore, about a kid named Riley who wears whatever the occasion calls for, that is banned in various places, all the way up through young adult novels, including the National Book Award finalist What Girls Are Made Of, that explores the terrain of what it means to be in a female body, what it means to be loved, and what are the conditions under which one can be loved, and what are the various levels of love, including love between a person and an animal, love between a person and a parent, love between a person and God or an idea of God, and self-love. So that one's banned maybe more than my others.
Because, we got to ban love, right?
Right. I have two fantasy-esque novels. One is a retelling of sort of the damsel in distress who's rescued. It's called Damsel, rescued from a dragon, and is told by the prince, "Don't worry about it." Like, she wakes up naked in his arms, no memory. "Don't worry, just kind of sit there and look pretty, and I'm going to be king now, and everything's going to be great." And she starts to sort of poke holes as she gets back to his kingdom and starts to wonder where she came from. And it's a story. It's about how misogyny poisons all the waters. I get letters from. I have another book called A Boy Called Bat and its sequels. That's probably definitely my best seller. It's about a kid, an autistic kid named Bixby Alexander Tam, whose mom brings home an orphan skunk. She's a vet, and he becomes determined to keep and care for it. All three of the Bat books have been banned because because really doesn't matter, but they happen to be put on a list of diverse reads, coming back to CRT, that was meant to help librarians expand their collections. People said, you should buy these Bat books along with these books by these queer and black authors, and it'll expand your collection. And one of the groups got a hold of the list and just banned, started making a movement to ban every book on that list. It's never about the books. It's always about identity. So that's who I am and what I write. I certainly don't relish the idea of my books being banned, especially as a writer for kids and teens. What happens is they don't even know. It's not like Mouse. When Mouse got banned, everyone got very upset, and they all went out and bought Mouse, and it became a bestseller again. Mouse is one of the most important books of my life. It is the inspiration for a lot of what I do. But right alongside Mouse, there's all these other books by Black and brown and queer and feminist and Jewish writers that are just sort of quietly disintegrating and disappearing all across the country. I have so many friends who are writers, and we're all seeing the same thing happening with our books.
So Eric, let's talk about that quiet removal of stories. The most recent report that Penn issued this fall, which was a study of the 2022-2023 school year, found that 30% of all books that are getting banned have to do with sexual content, but specifically have to do with LGBTQ stories, either books that center those stories are often written by LGBTQ writers. Let's talk about what happens when a reader no longer, especially a young reader, doesn't encounter stories that reflect who they are or who they're wondering, what they're wondering about who they are as they're discovering themselves.
Well, I'm a historian, and I primarily of mid-century America, so 1950s and 60s, well before the internet. And during that time, there was what historians call a conspiracy of silence around queerness or sexual deviancy, as it was called. And it was to the extent that the word homosexuality was not even in many dictionaries. And so if you didn't have the internet, certainly wasn't talked about on television or radio, the only place you could go to learn about these feelings that you had that were deviant, the only place you could go was the library. And so time and time again, when I read the oral histories or the interviews I conducted with activists who somehow, the birthplace of the gay rights movement in America is here in LA. And time again, these activists first found the words for themselves via literature. And I think the other side, those carrying out these bans, understand the relationship between literature and identity. It's cliche, but time and time again, research has shown that you can't be what you can't see. And that's true whether it's via television, through literature, and through books. The good news is, despite these efforts and despite these horrific numbers, and I think it explains why there's so much fear or this excitement on the other side that's trying to ban our stories, is Gen Z, 20% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ+. 20%. And it's no coincidence that Gen Z is also reading more books than any other generation alive, and that's including baby boomers. And so the other side sees, maybe they don't realize exactly what they're seeing, but they see these two phenomena. And fortunately, no matter what we do as activists, this new generation, they've kind of got it figured out. And I think it's just a matter of us, enabling them to fight back and giving them the tools to make sure that they still have access to stories, and especially those who have less access.
So I think it's, it is very telling that so much of the book banning movement, the folks who are fighting to ban books or stories, it does come from this place of fear, right? It does come from, well, if my child doesn't read it, they won't know it, they won't encounter it, they maybe won't become it. I can't even understand that. But it really, I want to go back to critical race theory. First of all, I think it's really important because CRT gets thrown around a lot. I'd love for you to give us a definition, because I hear it used incorrectly all the time, which speaks to the fear of, it's like, well, I don't want to encounter a history that makes me uncomfortable. So can you just give us a basic definition? Because without question, the fight against CRT was the precursor to what this fight is right now. Yeah.
Sure. So critical race theory is both a theory and a practice that investigates the ways in which racial discrimination continues to persist despite civil rights advancements, and commits to ensuring liberation. And so that's a very academic response, right? And to break it down a little bit further, there are some core tenets of critical race theory. And one of the main ones is storytelling, right? It's understanding that the people that are experiencing oppression are knowledge producers of their experience, and as such should be looked to when understanding how these systems and structures have been allowed to persist over centuries. And so going back to the esteemed authors on this panel, one of the things that is really important is that we have access to stories, to counter stories, to counter narratives, because that's the only way we're going to be able to develop a full picture and be able to, you know, ensure that the children that are coming up in this generation have access to the tools and the resources they need to address some of the most pressing racial and social justice issues of our time.
Good. So now y'all don't need to go to law school. You're good to go. So let's talk about those stories. I mean, Alana, your stories are to build not just an understanding of yourself, of someone's understanding of themselves, but also to understand someone else. And you know, as you go around, you've been so busy on a book tour. I'm curious, like, what do you hear from kids? What difference does it make for them, you know, to be able to encounter these stories? What are they learning when the books are when they are on the shelves? Yeah.
I think what you said about you can't be it if you can't see it, is that what you said? Yeah, I like that. I often say, like, you don't know that something exists unless you have the language for it. You don't know it, you can't see it until you hear the word for it. So it's like, if you hear if you're introduced to a new kind of bird, all of a sudden you start looking around, you see that bird in more places. You're like, oh, I had no idea. This bird didn't exist a week ago. Anyone had that experience when you hadn't heard of something or seen it and suddenly it's everywhere? And that is true with books. I get letters from people. Adults read my books too, so don't feel bad if you want to buy one of my books. Please do. Who write to me. I get so many letters from women who say, I had no idea it was an abusive relationship. I didn't understand what gaslighting was until I saw it in your book, in your fantasy novel, and all of a sudden I understood that I am being abused. I get these letters a lot. I get letters from kids and their parents who tell me that they didn't know they were autistic. The kid didn't know until after he read my book. The teacher wrote to me and said, she had this autistic kid in her class, and she was reading A Boy Called Bat to the class, and she knew this boy was autistic, and his parents, he had a diagnosis, but they hadn't told him, because they didn't want to label him. And he went up to the teacher and asked if he could borrow the book, and he took it home, and he told his parents, read this book, this is me, I'm Bat. And it opened up this dialogue. He didn't have that word. He didn't have the word autistic. He didn't have an image until he got the book. So yeah, if they don't understand the concept, you can't develop a feeling of empathy or even self-love for these things you don't know about yourself. I was just on a book tour for my new book, which is called The Blood Years. It's a historical fiction novel based on my grandmother's teenage years in Chernovitz, Romania, as a Jewish person. And I went to Virginia, and I had this big group of like 200 students, they're 8th and 9th graders, and I start talking about my book, and I mention the Holocaust, and I sort of see this sort of cover, this sort of glaze over a lot of their faces. I said, wait a second, let me stop. How many of you have heard of the Holocaust? And about 1 out of every 3 or 4 hands went up. And my book, I think my books are important, right? But it's not just my books. It's like, if you don't want people to know about things, if you don't want people to feel bad about, racism and slavery and the Holocaust and, oppressing queer people, you don't teach about it, and then it's this weird sort of desire to, keep kids innocent is what people are saying, but really what we're trying to do is keep them ignorant. And this line between innocence and ignorance is is so insidious. And it's obviously the people whose kids aren't in a group that has been oppressed that gets to sort of stay innocent, right? Because the other kids already know, the black kids already know, and the queer kids know, and the Jewish kid who's afraid of, being called out for being a Jew, they already know what it is. So I went off topic there, but I get very upset when I hear people say that your book is stealing, away kids' innocence. So a book is this wonderful, wonderful place to practice being uncomfortable and to practice saying no. It's an opt-in situation. If a kid comes across something that makes them uncomfortable, they have this ability to say, I'm not ready for this, and to close it and walk away. And I always say, gosh, I wish I would have known when I was a younger person, because I'm a lot like Bat. I don't catch on real quick to a lot of things. Bat and I have a lot of similarities. I didn't know I could leave a situation that made me uncomfortable. I didn't know I had the right to autonomy and to follow what felt okay in my body. So I think that if someone, and my books are weird and gross, some of them, and if someone reads one of them and says, that's gross, I don't like that, and they put it down and walk away, I say, that's a big win, right? That's a kid who decided they didn't want to be in that situation and left. And so if you don't give young people an opportunity to experience discomfort, and then you don't give them an opportunity to figure out what consent feels like, even, and how they can consent and opt into something. And what happens is people come back around. They feel uncomfortable, they go away, they work on it in their head, they come back, and when they're ready, to digest more of the information. So I'm sorry that I took up so much space there.
No. So let's talk about that line between innocence and ignorance, because a lot of times if you're reading, if you're looking at the headlines about the banning of books, what you'll read is there's pornography in our schools. We need to get rid of the pornography in our schools, or they're teaching our children, X, Y, or Z, and the folks who are challenging books oftentimes cite sexual content as being inappropriate, or that sort of thing. In the business, we know, generally speaking, when you read a challenge that says there's pornography, let's be very, very clear. I'm not an attorney. Are there any attorneys in the room? Aside from you. I was trying to give you a break. Okay, so, well, maybe you can help me out. So, for something to be pornographic, talk about the Miller test for a second. There's no attorneys in this room? Okay, fine, you're on. Okay, you want to be on for the Miller test real quick? I just want to be super clear that when you hear there's pornography in the library, or pornography in our schools, or there are teachers teaching pornography, let us dispel once and for all why that cannot be. Because for something to be pornographic, it has to have failed the Miller test, right? Yeah. The Miller test is a three-pronged. I only know two of the prongs, so I don't know. So basically, for something to be pornographic, it needs to titillate.
It needs to be designed to titillate.
Right, it needs to whatever. It needs to have no artistic value. And there's one other thing that maybe someone can Google. But
it's appeal to prurient interests.
Yes, that's what it is. Say it again, louder.
Appeal to prurient interests.
Okay. So at PEN America, when we see a challenge that says something is pornography, what we know that means is actually it's a book that, again, these are not books that are dealing with sexual violence. That's a different category that they use. But when they say pornography, 9 times out of 10, what they're talking about is non-heteronormative sexual encounters or questioning, a book that centers an LGBTQ character. And so I'm wondering, help us understand that, right? Because I think most of us feel Target has rainbow flags in it, right? We're in a moment in time in which it feels like there's more acceptance for the community. So if we're in that moment of time, why do you think that there's been such a pushback against queer literature and content in this moment?
Well, fortunately for historians, but unfortunately for humanity, history is cyclical. It repeats itself. And so, time and time again, there is progress that is made, and then there is backlash to that progress. And this goes all the way back to the First Inquisition. Before it was pornography, it was heresy. And we all, whether it was ethnic minorities, Jews, Muslims, or sexual deviants, books weren't just burned, but people were also. And the good news is, out of the Inquisition came the Renaissance. I study the Lavender Scare, which is the systematic persecution of queer folks in the federal government. But as a result of that overstepping by McCarthy and his Republican allies in the 50s and 60s, it quite literally created the movement for queer liberation. It was a instance of police brutality and harassment at the Stonewall Inn that then caused the Stonewall riots that then created the 1970s movement for queer liberation. Like you said, in 2020, I think we had this moment of catharsis and possibility. I think it's not a coincidence that the Pride marches that year, Bank of America and Chipotle didn't have floats that year. It was a march for all Black lives, for queer and trans lives. And I think we saw a glimmer of what is possible and what pride and true equity could really mean. And now we're experiencing the opposite swing of the pendulum. The good news is, I think, in addition to what Gen Z is having none of this, because not only are they reading more, they're also voting more than any young generation in the history of America. They are learning about themselves, they're finding the vocabulary for themselves, and also the other side is overstepping. You were talking about Iowa, and correct me if I'm wrong, but according to the new ban on sexual activity, is it?
Any book that has a sexual encounter in it, any sex, any mention of sex, is now up for restrictions.
And therefore, the first book to be...
Anyone want to think of the first book that you can think? Exactly.
Right.
The Bible is now being banned in Iowa.
Right.
And Utah, by the way. So, yeah.
So, I mean, you're starting to get these stories of overstepping, and you're starting to see not just the fear, but the absurdity of these tactics, and they're starting to out themselves as not just being scared, but actually this fear is manufactured. It is a political tool, and that was also true during the Inquisition, during Jim Crow, during the Lavender Scare, during the AIDS crisis. Fear of the other is always a very, very convenient tool to consolidate power until that fear starts consuming itself. And I think we're going to start to see that, but again, 2024, an election year, I think it's about sharing those stories to be able to say, enough is enough.
Just this last week, Scholastic book fairs. You knew I was going to do this, right? So everybody remembers the Scholastic book fairs in your school, gym, whatever. It's a primary way for children's lit and young adult authors to both sell their books and to also reach audiences. Many times, it's the only access some kids have to new titles. And this week, Scholastic rolled out a plan that would have their normative book that they felt like was a way, it was in addressing concerns that parents have, where they could roll out their book fairs and just have a separate section. We've heard this before. a separate section, and I think it's titled like "Our Stories," or I don't know, something like that. I think it's obvious what we at Penn America think of that plan, but can you talk about like what's dangerous? I mean, it was an attempt to keep titles in circulation, to keep access to them, to try and make sure in communities where they would otherwise not have any books at all, right? No scholastic at all,
Right.
to keep it in there. But can you talk a
Sort
little
of,
bit about
yeah.
that and potentials for self-censorship, like that whole thing, to not end up on that shelf?
Yeah. So basically, Scholastic wants to still, because it's a business, so they want to still be in every school. So they want to sort of say, well, here's the, an opt-in collection of books mostly by, Black and brown and queer creators. It's called like, I don't know, diversities in that, and it's like an add-on package. But then those titles have been sort of, including like Amanda Gorman's book, have been taken out of the main, the list of that every student gets, and then librarians can decide if they want to add on this thing. And the problem with it is that it's doing the censors' work for them. It is saying, oh, here, let me fall over myself to censor these books so that you don't have to. And I mean, that's what I have to say about it. I think it's a terrible error on the part of Scholastic. I think the most important thing that writers can do is to not do their work for them, to not edit, to not say, well, maybe I won't include a gay character in my family in my story because I don't want my book to get banned. Because it's not about the books. It's like this chipping away of anything that isn't straight, white, cisgender, heteronormative. And ultimately, I think it's about a desire to silence an enormous portion of our population. I think honestly it's like the next step will be a desire to close libraries is where I think it's headed. And a desire to close public schools. I think that it's like a chipping away at the pieces until the whole thing falls apart. That's what I think is happening. You get all these teachers quitting. Well, what are you going to do? Well, we can't have school then. Imagine if you tried to open a public library right now, like if it didn't exist, and we're like, let's have this place where people can go and have free access to information and clean bathrooms and, professionals who will help them find out information they want. Like that would never happen right now, right? So that's what I think.
I mean, without question, I don't think that it's a coincidence that that educational censorship and book bans target what have historically been the most democratic, with a small d, democratic institutions in this country, right? Places, public education and public libraries. Oftentimes the first encounter for immigrants, it's the only source of education for vulnerable populations. We hear a lot at Penn, well, it's not banned because it's on Amazon, so I can buy it on Amazon, and it totally, it assumes an access that does not exist for all children. So I think you're 100% right. So if we haven't completely depressed you, let's talk. Because that chipping away is a very organized chipping away. So, this isn't just a here or there kind of thing. There is an organized movement. I'm sure many people have heard of Moms for Liberty that are leading this locally. But the most concerning thing is this in conjunction with state legislation. State legislation that's controlling what can be taught in classrooms. So can you talk a little bit about this within the context and maybe give some examples? I think we all know about Florida, but can you give some examples of kind of like how these two things, the state legislation is the new player here that's influencing what is being taught or what teachers feel like they can teach? Yeah.
Right. So And just going back to the Trump administration's executive order, which was rescinded by the Biden administration, and even though it was rescinded, this executive order has created the foundation or the framework for other legislation to run, right? And so what that looks like is, I mentioned earlier that there are 750 different measures that we have found. And of those 750, a majority of those are legislation. And it's very interesting which state or locality has the most. And so maybe this is a good time for some audience interaction. So where do you all think the most anti-CRT measures have been introduced? Texas. Florida in the South, like South Carolina, maybe? Maybe. Okay, it's the federal government, it's Congress. So Congress has introduced 55 different pieces of legislation to ban and to restrict certain trainings, teachings, and curriculum. What is very hopeful about that, though, is none of them have been passed, right? Because then that would affect every single state in the union. The next highest is Florida, followed by Georgia and then Texas. And Florida has become this leader in anti-CRT measures and book bans and disinformation as it relates to access to truthful information about race and systemic racism. And one particularly egregious bill is the Stop Woke Act. And so that's Florida HB 7. And HB 7 essentially tried to target curriculum, instruction, and training in higher education and in K through 12 education as well. And it did something that had never been done up until that point before, where they conflated or combined bans. And so in addition to banning critical race theory, they also banned LGBTQIA plus identities, right? And so Florida essentially was sued, and part of HB 7 has been rescinded, but it is still active in K through 12 schools. The impact or the legacy of HB 7 is that it signaled to other states what can and cannot be done. And so almost immediately in Ohio, HB 1557 was introduced, and it did this same thing of coupling a ban on critical race theory or access to truthful information about race with invisibilizing LGBTQIA plus students and identities. And so there's this saying about California, and it is, as goes California, so does the rest of the country. And now my saying for Florida, as it relates to this, is as goes Florida, so will the rest of the extremist conservative states. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we go forward.
So I'm curious what you think the role of, we're going to get into the role of parents and individuals in a second, but what do you think the role of schools, whether they be K through 12 schools or higher education, what do you think their responsibility is to protect free expression in this moment then?
Well, I think above even self-expression is just protecting kids, their own lives, because I think simultaneous with these bans, the anti-CRT efforts, anti-drag, anti-trans laws, is a mental health crisis that's happening in schools also. 53% of trans and non-binary kids have seriously contemplated suicide in the past year. Fortunately, there's also research that having access to LGBTQ plus stories in schools decreases that chance by 25%. So it's not just a matter of, letting kids be their full selves, it's letting them survive. And I think it's up to us to kind of reframe this narrative of it's not just about, the stories the kids are reading or this so-called pornography, it's about actually protecting people's lives. And, you know, I think the first obligation of any teacher, any principal is protecting their kids and making sure that schools are a safe place to be. And right now with teachers, especially in Florida, fearing for their own jobs, their own livelihoods, and so many retiring or quitting, you know, I think it's up to us, especially any parents, to support, you know, those teachers and make sure, you know, if they're saying, hey, we need help in the school board election, or the NEA has a call to action, showing up for these educators who are actually, you know, putting their livelihoods on the line.
I think that's so important because I think a lot of people don't realize that in most places you don't have to be a parent in a school to challenge a book. In Florida, there's many places where you know, we can show you lots of data. I mean, Amanda Gorman's book is a really great example. That book was removed from circulation, removed from the libraries, and ultimately restricted, moved to a different age category for kids to now access The Hill We Climb, which was always written for elementary school age kids. They now have to pass a reading test, and they have to have a parent's note, and all of this. They have to be, I think, over 7th grade or something like that. That came about in Miami Lakes, Florida, by one person who was not a parent, who in later interviews admitted she had never read the book. In fact, the challenge page says, it says, first of all, it says that the book was written by Oprah, because she wrote the foreword. A good sign, by the way, that they don't read the books would be that, and cited indoctrination as the reason. So if there are parents or interested adults who can do that, you were telling a story about in Arkansas?
Right.
Yeah.
So there are 2 pieces of legislation, one in Florida and one in Arkansas, that allows for anyone living in the area, whether or not you have a student in the school district, you can sit in the classroom and see what the teacher is teaching and the curriculum that's being used to ensure that critical race theory isn't being taught. And that's a legislation in Arkansas. And Florida was one of the first places in which a private cause of action was allowed for people who don't have students in the school district. And private cause of action essentially just gives you the right to sue. So if you don't have a child in a school district in Florida and you feel as though critical race theory is being taught, or one of these prohibitions, then you can file suit against the specific district, even the teacher in some cases, the administration, and not ever have a student in the schools.
And you can just go into the classroom where these
In
kids are
Arkansas.
and have access
Arkansas.
to the kids. Like,
Yep.
menace them, stare at them,
Yeah.
do whatever, basically.
Yeah, and the intention is to ensure that these prohibitions aren't being taught, or the curriculum is in alignment with what the legislature expects. And then there's also a question as to, is the legislature the right governing body to decide what it is that can and cannot be taught in school, right? So there are all of these questions that haven't been answered, but still there are these prohibitions or these demands that are being made as to how we might go about restricting this information, and even back to your point, that harms students at the end of the day.
So what do you do with the fact that, Moms for Liberty and others who challenge books, they say that this is a parents' rights issue. They say that they are protecting their children from inappropriate stories. Who could possibly object to, this is what parents should be doing. They should be actively engaged in their schools, and they should be actively aware of what their kids are being taught. And, you know, who can argue with parents' rights? So what would you say in response to that?
Well, I think children are whole people and citizens and have rights too. A child is not a possession. A child is not a limb. So I think protecting children's rights is incredibly important and sometimes gets, you know, forgotten. And maybe that's because we do want to see our children as, not all of us, but many of us want to see them as extensions of the self and as a product, a vessel to be filled, you know, and not a whole independent person who should have the protections and the freedoms that everyone, you know, that their elders have as well. So I'd say it's a disrespect for children as whole people and a desire to objectify children is what these people are doing.
I always think of, and it's a source of hope, of the Briggs Initiative in '78. Was anyone here for that? So, so '78. This is the era of Anita Bryant, Protect Our Children, the orange juice goddess, right? And you know, very similar rhetoric that we're experiencing right now. And it got so bad, it started in Florida, and it...
God bless Florida.
God bless Florida. Made its way to California. She and her allies were successful in essentially banning queer teachers from just teaching, from doing their jobs. And that made it on a statewide ballot here in '78. And you know, it was looking really, really bad. It looked like we were going to lose by a 2-1 margin. And what a group of activists did is they realized that it's not enough just to convince people that queer teachers matter, sadly. You also have to teach people that everyone, all teachers, are harmed when you institute these types of horrible, fear-inducing regulations, because what stops, you know, any kid who gets put into detention from saying, "Oh, my teacher is gay," right? Back then, or here, "Oh, this is pornography. I don't want to read this," you know. And so, what they so successfully did is they didn't just convince the liberal side of the state to vote this bill down. They convinced the governor at the time. Anyone know who the governor was? Ronald Reagan, who came out against the Briggs Initiative in favor of queer teachers, but the real, you know, reason that he gave was that it would hurt all teachers and therefore all students. And so I think even though, you know, ideally we're not having to rely on a Ronald Reagan in order to take our cause, the other side is really tactically genius. And I think we have to think outside of the box and get sometimes a little messy and sometimes get in bed with folks, you know, who might not necessarily be ideologically pure, but at least, you know, if we're able to persuade anyone that, you know, all teachers are affected by these bills and therefore all students, then, hey, it's that story we got to tell at all costs.
I think one of my most salient memories from law school is that I'm sitting in my first year constitutional law class, and the professor, and I went to law school in DC, I went to Georgetown, and the professor asked, well, what was the Civil War about? And about 70% of us said, oh, it was most definitely about enslavement. But 30% was like, no, it's about states' rights. And I'm like, yeah, but states' rights to do what, right? Let's be honest. And so as I'm thinking about these book bans and how parents' rights is oftentimes pit against students' rights in ways that is incompatible, even though it is, it reminds me that if we continue down this road that we're currently on of book bannings and restrictions on truth and education, then what we're going to have is an even wider gap by the time these students go to law school, or by the time they get to medical school, or whatever professional degree it is that they want to receive. And that's going to devastate the impact on everyone living in this country, sort of like what you were saying, right? If you don't understand, right, or if you're taught that, you know, we were all singing Kumbaya during the Declaration of Independence signing, when in actuality, what it really was about was the dispossession of indigenous lands, when it was about the capital extraction of Black bodies, when it was about all of these things and all these compromises and backdoor deals that were made. It doesn't allow for our children to understand where there might be areas of racism creeping up in their own professions, right? So while it was 70-30, 10-ish years ago in Washington, D.C., right, when my constitutional law professor asked that question, it could possibly be 40-60, right, pretty soon. And that's going to have a detrimental impact on how we are able to exist as a democracy.
I'm oftentimes, you know, sitting where we sit in, not just in California, but in Los Angeles, you know, I get, yeah, but, you know, it's not really, I mean, yeah, it's like, it's Florida, it's Texas, like, you know, it's somewhere else. And aside the fact that your federal, your pop quiz that I think we all failed, you know, is that it was federal legislation, the most legislation, you know, what is it, you know, what, I mean, Alana, I'm thinking like you and I met virtually at first in June when Huntington Beach City Council was proposing a review of all of the titles in their library because of pornography, code for LGBTQ books. And I know you spoke beautifully at that city council meeting, and I know that city council just actually passed just last week. A conservative majority on the Huntington Beach City Council passed, despite voluminous community, you know, objections. So before we sit too comfortably in our little blue bubble, you know, sitting here in California, not just thinking of this as a national issue, but as a potential local issue, what should we all be aware of, and what can we do? Yeah.
So in my role as CRT Forward Project Director, one of the things that I do is try my very best to have a broad understanding of all of these measures across all 50 states, and I'm usually pretty good at it, but the statistics around California is very interesting, right? And so California, based on our research, has introduced 13 different anti-CRT measures across 8 school boards, and 9 have been enacted, impacting 136,000 students in K through 12 district-specific schools. And so it's not, we haven't found any anti-CRT efforts in Los Angeles, but it's, if you look at our map, and you could Google CRT Forward UCLA, most of the activity is concentrated in Southern California, which is interesting. Temecula, Paso Robles, Ramona, all of these places with different levels of varying anti-CRT measures. And so it's important to know what's going on in your own backyard. We've gotten emails from parents who, because they saw our website, realized that a measure was pending and went to a school board meeting in order to challenge it. And so we are providing education and resources around challenging this narrative of, oh, it's never California, you know. And so educating yourself is really important so that you can know and be aware of what's going on.
Alana, what was it like? Because I was only watching you on
Yeah.
the live stream, which was enough for me. What was it like to
Yeah.
be in that room?
Yeah, a woman, yelled pedophile in my face, like she's just never read my books and she doesn't know me. And yet, just because I was there standing up for these books, she, was calling me a pedophile in front of, this room full of people. I got into a little flag war with this terrible man up in the front who wanted to hold this poster up. And it was a mess. It was crazy. And then it passed. So now they're going to have 21 parents who are going to review potentially every book in the library to decide
That's like 400,000 titles,
to
by the
decide
way.
if it's pornographic according to a very unclear illegal definition of what that might be, and then move the books to a restricted, take them out of the kids area and put them in the adult area, books that were, mostly books that have two dads, or honestly, it doesn't matter to me. The book, if it's in a children's library collection, has been collected by a professional. The question is, do we trust teachers and librarians, or don't we? They are doing their job. Their job is to review the publications, to go to conferences, to educate themselves about what is available, and to curate a selection of books for their group of people at schools and at public libraries. And so what these measures are saying is that, no, we don't trust teachers and librarians to do their jobs. We think that, because it upsets us, it should be removed. So why would someone be a teacher or a librarian anymore? They weren't getting paid enormous amounts of money. They were getting paid in part, community respect and knowing they were doing something valuable for their community. So I say we need to protect our teachers and our librarians. You need to write to your teachers and librarians, send them an email, tell them you're standing there, what do they need? Talk to your kids about what is freedom, what are their rights, what is the history of our country, what is a book, its purpose, and what do they think? Should a book be taken out because it has two dads? And invite your kid to have a conversation with you about these things, and your grandkids, and that's what I think.
I mean, Eric, I'm thinking there was a drag queen story hour in North, where was it? It was Studio City that was protested. I'm thinking about the Satakoy school where the protest, I'm thinking, it's right here. So what are you seeing? Talk about the bus. What are your efforts to kind of counter that?
Sure. Well,
Talk about the bus, and if you can later, he has pictures or go online because it's beautiful.
Sure.
But
No, thanks for asking. My partner, who happens to be a drag queen, and I started an LGBT bookshop called shopqueer.co, and we're based in Santa Monica, and often go to West Hollywood, and thought, okay, that would be a logical place to open an LGBT bookshop, but we opened the shop on Coming Out Day, so almost exactly a year ago, October 11th, 22, and we sat down and we said, it would be easy and we'd make a lot of money opening up a gay bookshop in, well, I don't know if we'd make that much money, but we'd sell a lot more books in West Hollywood. But I'm from Texas, and it breaks my heart as someone who grew up going to an amazing public school, who learned everything I know about the world from my teachers. My mom was a teacher, to see what teachers, librarians, and parents, and kids are going through in these states now with the scholastic segregation of books. We had the idea of instead of having just a brick and mortar here, of taking a bus and converting it into a traveling LGBT bookshop. So that's what we did. And so right now, I think every other week, it's at Melrose Trading Post right down the road. But we're fundraising to take it on the road, and partnering with some really amazing organizations. We're partnering up with Glisten, which does some incredible work, and hoping to be able to give away 10,000 books to LGBT centers that need libraries, that need books, because even if these books are being removed from schools, there are still nonprofits or other organizations that could give books away, or at least lend them. And so that's what we're really excited about doing, and it's a little scary. My mom thinks it's pretty scary, but it's amazing to see when you're able to reframe the conversation into one of hope and of action, people just get so excited because it's so easy just to, doom scroll, but when you actually are talking or testifying with teachers and the folks who are actually on the ground fighting, it's just so hard to walk away not feeling mobilized and hopeful, because there's so many attorneys, especially whether it's the ACLU or so many other organizations that are fighting, on the front lines of these fights. So I think it's just up to us to support them and get these books into the hands of those that can distribute and then read them.
So I want to open it up to questions, but before I do, let's go with that hope. Let's, because this is a tough topic. But I also think that 2023 has been the year of the most book bans that we've seen across the country. This kind of exponential growth that we've been talking about. But it's also, I kind of feel like that turning point you were talking about, where like the overstepping has so overstepped that there is now, organized resistance, and you can see great, oh my gosh, like the best, like, you want to talk about like what's the opposite of doom scrolling? Like whatever it is, like to see like YouTube videos of people showing up to their school board meetings, people like you, Alana, who like give these great speeches. There's like a 101-year-old woman who was talking, who like made a quilt of like all the banned books and talked about, her story, and at Penn, where we've started litigation, we sued a school district in Florida. This is a new strategy of bringing both parents and teachers and publishers and writers and Penn together in a combined lawsuit. We'll see how that goes. Perhaps there'll be more in the year ahead. But what's a hopeful thing? Like, what's one thing that you're hoping to see more of, or you think we need to see more of 2023 and as we head into 2024, which, is an election year, so.
I think one of, I really love critical race theory. It's such a poetic theory, and one of my favorite tenets of critical race theory is this idea that was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw called race reform and retrenchment. And in this theory, she asks us to consider whether or not civil rights progress looks more like, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, right? And what she shows us is that, you mentioned pendulum, Eric, but what Kimberly Crenshaw describes it as is hills and valleys. So there are times and periods in which we're on this pinnacle, and that's the reform, right? That's when everything's great and dandy and we're not doom scrolling, but doing the opposite of that, right? And then there's this period called retrenchment. So it's the valley. And we're in retrenchment right now because all of these rights that we have accumulated over decades are now being challenged across all sorts of areas. And so one of the things that keeps me hopeful is this idea of reform and retrenchment, right? Because after and you feel it when you're in the valley because you're like, I'm in this valley, but there's always reform and hope on the horizon. And that's what I really love about this tenet of race reform and retrenchment, that you're never stuck in a valley. There's always something to look forward to. And what I really look forward to is the continued activism that Eric mentioned of students. Of Gen Z is going to save us, I swear. Glenn Youngkin opened this tip line to report critical race theory for anyone who was teaching it, and Gen Z flooded that tip line saying that they wanted to learn about race, they wanted to learn this information, and they demanded to. And within a week, the tip line was completely closed, because there was no one that was reporting any instances of critical. So that's one of the things that keeps me hopeful, that we're never going to be stuck in this valley, as demonstrated by critical race theory scholars. And even more so, the vehicle through which we're going to get to reform is through students.
I like that there's like all these different ways of saying kind of the same thing. And so the one I like, it's pretty much the same thing as what you just said. It's called agathism, which was a new term to me not too long ago. So it's different than optimism. Optimism is sort of the belief that things will turn out for the best. And then there's like fatalism, that things will turn out the way they're supposed to. But agathism is the belief that, and I might be slightly misinterpreting it, but it works for me. The idea that individual things don't always turn out well. Sometimes things are disasters and they're terrible. Not everything will go well. But there is this sort of, and it's cyclical, there is this sort of cycling that each time you retrench, the next movement, if you step far enough back in history, things do get better. Even as they get worse, the next cycle, you're not just doing this, we're doing this, and we are getting better even though we're maybe in a retrenchment. So that's agathism. So that keeps me hopeful.
Yeah, I think, I'm a book writer and a book seller, and I'm sure you have heard from agents or editors saying, it's hard to market to, an LGBT audience, right? Or we're too niche. And I think now, especially given the economic context that we find ourselves in, especially here in Los Angeles, queer stories, Black stories, marginalized stories in general are really the first to be cut. And you're seeing that across the board in every studio and every publishing house. And yet, you look at the most successful young adult book of the last 3 years was a gay love story by Adam Silvera, who happens to live here in Los Angeles. You look at probably the most successful film of the summer was a gay love story, based on Red, White, and Royal Blue, based on a gay love story between an American and British prince. And so I think there's, despite these undercurrents of regression, I think there's, especially fueled by Gen Z, this demand that is just undeniable for queer stories. And I think it's up to us, to support the authors, especially the ones who aren't yet on the New York Times. Find those, local authors who are putting out their first book, probably got, barely any advance, if any at all. And they're the ones who really need those sales. So just finding out, whether it's from your local bookseller, from your librarian, hey, who are kind of the local or the kind of the new books that are coming out that I should be reading that maybe I haven't heard of, because those are the folks who could use those sales more than anyone else, and they're going to be able to get that next book deal because of the performance of their book, because of what we do in bookstores and in libraries.
Okay, I think we have time for a few questions. Yeah? Should I Oprah it, or?
As I've been listening to the schools develop these new curriculums, I've heard that the Jewish story is becoming less and less, and that disturbs me. Because there's so much denial going on out there. How can you comment on that?
I mean, I am not an expert, although I am a parent, and I have noticed that every time that we have tried as a state to kind of have some sort of, ethnic education, I mean, those are the most heated discussions, and I don't have an answer for what can you do to make sure that your story is told. I think the issue is that for every identity that there is, there's not one way to tell that story, and that is the challenge. So, I don't have an assessment of how California's done it other than it's trying to do it. And that its efforts might be flawed, for multiple reasons and for multiple groups. I mean, I think the thing about free expression, when you think about it at the end of the day, is that challenge that our democracy asks of us to hold a multitude of stories and a multitude of things that we might not agree with. And I'm not talking to diminish the Jewish story, but I am talking about how do we make compromise in what is taught. And I think most of the time that's what I'm seeing. But as a parent in like the legislation of ethnic studies, but it's been a long time since I've had a kid in the public school system, so I am not an expert. I don't know if anybody feels like they can talk on that.
I think just to respond, when we first started tracking these anti-CRT measures, a lot of them mimicked the language that was in the Trump administration's executive order. One of the main things that was in that order stated that you can't teach anything that's going to make people feel shame or guilt, or you can't teach, and then these states started picking up that language and using it, and then people started asking about, well, how are we supposed to teach about issues of oppression if we can't teach about these divisive concepts as outlined in this order? And so what that led to, especially in Florida, was a lot of coalition between Black and Jewish activists to ensure that history was being taught, especially from oppressed communities. And so I think that's what Allison is getting at as well, that it's really going to take coalition building in order to ensure that all of these histories are preserved and taught in a way that is accurate to history.
And that is something that the right is so good at, is coalition building and lining up to get things across the finish line. And I think that's something that is so important. Coalition building is the exact right term. I think if we want more Jewish stories told, we have to remember that we have to uplift the groups that are, also bigger, right? Because the Jewish is a pretty small population, and so you gotta team up and help queer voices and Black voices also. And I think that's we're all in the same boat.
I think it's also important to look at the fact that young people have the privilege of time and care, and once they become older people and they don't have that privilege of time and care, it's not that generations past, because I was part of the generation that was supposed to change the world, the baby boomers. We were supposed to change the world because when we were young and supported by our parents, we had a ton of radical ideals, and we were gonna do it. And then when we took on the baggage of family, all the responsibilities, well, there wasn't enough time. And now I'm looking at my grandchildren, those Generation Zs that are gonna save us, and I think we're getting into that same cycle of wishful thinking that someone else, it's our job. I don't care how old you are, it's your job to show up. And in the schools, it's really your job to show up when you're disconnected, when you don't have any skin in the game. So trying to convince others, you've got people showing up to sit in classrooms in Arkansas. I would say the first thing you can do to get rid of those people is demand background checks for everyone that comes through the door. A federal background check. Oh, you're like a teacher. You need to pass a background check. You need to be fingerprinted and you need to be registered. The drop-off of people willing to sit in that classroom will be instant. Oh, that's my right to privacy. I don't need the schools to know. It's a trick of playing their game and showing up. Oh, I can show up in a classroom in Arkansas and make sure that the oppressed are represented in excuse me, teacher, why aren't you talking about slavery? Why aren't you talking about critical race? Why aren't you talking about LGBTQI stuff? Why aren't you talking? I mean, turn it on its ear. The reason why Reagan supported teachers is because he could see what would happen if the state flipped and it was democratic and liberal. And he didn't want his people to struggle the way he thought we would struggle under that same guise. And we've got to start thinking that way. And then I'll put on my other hat as the president of the largest homeschooling organization. People that can disconnect from oppressive systems, they've got skin in the game too. We've got to convince people that don't have skin in the game. Yes, you do. Because your bus driver, your nurse, the person that's going to be taking care of you will be affected by this lack, more so than anything else. So we all have a role to play. If you live in a town with a school, a public school system, you can play a role.
I think, Eric, that's what you were saying in terms of that's the tipping point, is that this can't be about self-interest. This has to be about communal interest. And this has to be about, I think at the end of the day, our democracy depends on an informed civilian population. Like, it will not work if we are not educated. And that is both the purpose, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, that is, as you said at the very beginning, Alana, like, that's what they want, and that's what we have to fight against. So, yeah.
I think, too, just to clarify, I'm not putting the entire weight of this campaign or any future campaign on Gen Z. I think what's important to note is that these students have something to say and they want to say it. And I think what's also operating is that the people who are governing are so much older and disconnected from the issues that these students care about that they feel obligated to say something, and then the work that everyone else does should uplift and empower that. And so the data-focused work that I do academically, the coalitions I'm in with the ACLU and the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, the African American Policy Forum, all of these groups are working on our individual subject matter specific areas to help support the students who need to be heard.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of your perspective. It's been really interesting to hear and delve into a topic that is obviously really important. And I wanted to, Alana, was it? I think you had mentioned, and it may sound dramatic to folks, like the idea that, schools may be, like the end goal, for instance, is schools may be closing or libraries may be closing. And I'm curious to hear maybe from the panelists in terms of the history or the legality of things like that. Like, maybe it sounds dramatic to hear for the first time, but you do hear stories of, public library systems, their state funding may be rescinded if they do not ban these 5 books. And so in actuality, that's not, the idea of libraries closing is not the most dramatic thing that could happen, or schools closing, or all teachers leaving and then being replaced by non-certified teachers may not be the most dramatic thing. So maybe could, from any of your perspectives, can you shine a light on that and feel welcome to scare us a little bit? Because I think, as you mentioned before, the Holocaust did not start with the death camps. It started with removing identities. So go ahead and scare us a little bit. Tell us what we should not do. Yeah.
So I'm not an expert on that. I mean, what I can say is that it is so, like, I sometimes when I get a bad review from somebody, like on Goodreads, I like to say, well, I wrote a book and they wrote a comment, because it reminds me like how much work it took.
And also, it might have just been a bot that wrote the comments.
Sometimes.
So.
But basically, there's this glee, this childlike glee in destruction. It takes like so much effort. This is in the afterword of my novel, the new one. You see a whole group of kids spend hours like building a castle out of sand, working so hard and cooperatively, and then it just takes like one bully, a few kicks, to destroy the whole thing, And that is what I'm thinking when I think of like the school system or the library system, and these few bad actors who are loud and violent and you see it in that, the House of Representatives. They take such glee in destruction. And so I don't think it's far-fetched, I think we're seeing it happen in all these different aspects where a few bad actors are gleefully destroying systems that took so much work by so many. I think you have to build coalitions, and you have to pay attention, you know. I don't have any more answers other than I'm glad you guys are here doing some of that work tonight.
One of the things that we record on our website is measures that have been introduced and rejected as well, because we feel as though even if something has been introduced but not enacted, there is still this chilling effect or this idea that is now out there that is able to be picked up by someone else and, you know, ran with. And one of the rejected measures was out of Iowa, where the state legislature essentially wanted to create a voucher system that would use state funding to pull students out of public schools and put them into private schools if they didn't like what was being taught in that public school. And so that's a specific example of this erosion of the public schools in ways that are just antithetical to democracy and learning and truth and education. And so it's a real campaign, and it predates this specific, I guess, campaign on book bans and anti-CRT measures. But it is a reality, and in a lot of places, they are considering this similar, let's use state funds to fund private education and restrict students from public.
I think that's it. I think we're at time, but you know, I just want to say to that, you know, in the current moment that we're all living in right now, and to this issue, you know, someone mentioned, you know, Penn was founded 101 years ago. If you think about what was happening 101 years ago, you know, it was basically founded by people, by writers and allies who wanted to fight the rise of fascism. Right? What were we talking about? This, you know, or that everything is cyclical. And I think why this issue is so fundamentally important is because, and why it's so appropriate to be having this conversation in this space, surrounded by these pictures, surrounded by these documents and these stories, is that literature has always had the power to be the connective tissue of humanity. I want you to close your eyes and to think of the first book you read that opened your heart, not just your mind, but opened your heart to someone who was other than you. That's what we want for all children. That is what is so important. And that is what literature has the power to do. And when we lose that, we lose our humanity. And this place is a testament to what happens when we lose our humanity. So thank you so much for being with us and for engaging in this conversation. Please buy the books. I think we're signing some books, so please go on by that table, and thank you.